The official story of John D. Rockefeller's rise to wealth has a hole in it. Not a philosophical hole, not a matter of interpretation, not a gap you can fill with adjectives like industrious or frugal. A specific, bounded, documentary hole. Between the year John D. Rockefeller arrived in Cleveland as a 16-year-old bookkeeper with no family money and the year he controlled every oil refinery in that city, there is a span of roughly 12 years. The capital deployed in those 12 years does not reconcile with the income the record documents him earning. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is an arithmetic problem. And arithmetic problems have solutions. We are not saying John D. Rockefeller was secretly born rich. We are not saying the oil industry was a fraud. We are saying this: when you add up every documented source of income Rockefeller possessed between roughly 1855 and 1865, the numbers do not balance. The gap is not small. The gap is not explainable by thrift alone. And the institutions best positioned to resolve that gap have a structural interest in not resolving it. John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in Richford, New York, to William Avery Rockefeller and Eliza Davison. His father, William, was a traveling salesman, a confidence man, and in some documented instances, a patent medicine peddler who operated under an alias. His mother was deeply religious, frugal, and hard-working. The family moved frequently, eventually arriving in the Cleveland, Ohio area in 1853, when John was 14 years old. In September of 1855, at age 16, he began working as an assistant bookkeeper for a small produce commission firm called Hewitt and Tuttle. His starting salary was approximately 50 cents a day. He kept meticulous personal ledgers from the time he was a teenager, a habit he maintained his entire life. He called his first ledger Ledger A, and he reportedly kept it until his death. In 1858, at age 19, Rockefeller partnered with a slightly older English merchant named Maurice Clark to form Clark and Rockefeller. The capital each partner contributed was approximately $2,000. For Rockefeller, that $2,000 came partly from his savings and partly from a loan from his father William at 10% interest. That detail matters enormously, and we will return to it. By 1862, Clark and Rockefeller reportedly had revenues of over $500,000, benefiting from the outbreak of the Civil War, which generated enormous demand for provisions, grain, and other commodities. In 1863, Rockefeller entered the oil refining business. He and his partner Maurice Clark invested in a refinery with a chemist named Samuel Andrews. By 1865, Rockefeller had bought out the Clark brothers' stake at auction for $72,500, equivalent to between $1.2 and $1.5 million today. Now let's do the arithmetic. Between 1855 and 1865, even being generous with all estimates, you are looking at a personal accumulated capital base of perhaps $25,000 to $40,000 going into 1865. Against that, he deployed $72,500 in a single transaction. The gap is somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000. In 1865 dollars. The record does not explain where that capital came from. Between 1861 and 1865, the federal government was the largest single purchaser of provisions in American history. Commission merchants in cities like Cleveland, who had the right government contacts, could generate enormous profits. Clark and Rockefeller was, by the early 1860s, one of the more prominent produce commission houses in Cleveland. Whether it held direct government contracts or benefited indirectly through price inflation is not fully documented. Rockefeller's own recollections and random reminiscences are notably thin on the specifics of the Civil War years. He acknowledges that the war was beneficial to the commission business, without elaboration. The primary repository for Rockefeller family documentation is the Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow, New York. It holds millions of documents, financial records, and correspondence spanning more than a century. The Archive Center is a private institution, funded and governed by the Rockefeller family. The curator of any private archive is not a neutral party. They control what is preserved, cataloged, and made accessible. Ledger A, which Rockefeller reportedly kept his entire life, has never been published in full and is not listed as openly accessible in the Archive Center's finding aids in a way that invites detailed forensic scrutiny. The period 1855 to 1865 is specifically the period whose records are described in the thinnest terms. We are not saying these records were destroyed. We are saying the institution which controls them has an inherent conflict of interest. there is a strand of historical commentary that offers a more direct explanation, that Rockefeller's early capitalization came from established Eastern banking interests who identified oil as a strategic investment in the early 1860s. First anomaly, the loan from William Rockefeller at 10% interest. William's own finances are poorly documented, and his sources of income do not obviously explain how he had $2,000 available to loan his son. Second, the speed with which Clark and Rockefeller obtained credit lines from Cleveland banks in the early 1860s, a reputation built, in 1858, on approximately 3 years of bookkeeping. Third, the 1865 buyout auction. The heterodox reading asks, where did Rockefeller get the certainty he could secure financing for a number that exceeded his documented savings by a factor of 2 or 3? Rockefeller was not the only figure in the American industrial boom whose capital accumulation significantly outpaced his documented income during the critical founding window. Andrew Carnegie arrived in Pittsburgh with no family capital and worked as a telegraph messenger boy starting in 1850. By 1863, at age 27, he had accumulated investment positions worth tens of thousands of dollars. Jay Gould began as a leather merchant in upstate New York with no recorded family wealth, then appeared in New York financial markets in the early 1860s with the capital to execute large-scale railroad stock maneuvers. The pattern is not one man whose story has a gap. The pattern is an entire cohort of men who arrived at the threshold of the American industrial economy within roughly the same 5-year window, all deploying capital their documented histories cannot fully account for. The more parsimonious explanation is that there was a structural mechanism, a source of capital or a system of financial patronage that operated during this window and that has not been fully documented in the public historical record. The Rockefeller Foundation, founded in 1913, funded the development of modern medical education, the Green Revolution in agriculture, and the social sciences in American universities. Historians working within institutions that received Rockefeller funding were not told what conclusions to reach. No one needed to be. The structural logic of grant dependency is far more subtle and far more effective than direct censorship. Ida Tarbell, who published the history of the Standard Oil Company beginning in 1902, had no institutional entanglement with the Rockefeller family. She worked entirely from public records and interviews with former Standard Oil employees. She documented in forensic detail the methods by which Standard Oil achieved its monopoly, secret railroad rebates, industrial espionage, and predatory pricing. Her work triggered federal antitrust investigations and ultimately the 1911 Supreme Court dissolution of Standard Oil. Her method, working from public records, maintaining adversarial distance, following the money, is exactly the method that the capital gap question requires, and it is exactly the method that has not been systematically applied to the 1855 to -1865 period. First, the Cleveland municipal tax records for the period 1858 to 1870. Personal property tax filings would reflect the assessed value of business inventory, equipment, and financial instruments held by Cleveland residents. Second, the ledgers of Cleveland banking institutions with which Clark and Rockefeller maintained accounts in the early 1860s. Their records would show credit lines extended to Rockefeller, and whether unusual capital deposits preceded his major investment moves. Third, William Rockefeller's financial records. William died in 1906. His estate was probated in Cayuga County, New York, where he had spent his later years under the name Dr. William Livingston, a documented alias. Fourth, the congressional records of Civil War procurement investigations. The House Select Committee on Government Contracts published findings in 1862 containing extensive documentation of commission merchant activity in northern cities, including Cleveland. These are not exotic or inaccessible sources. They are the standard evidentiary toolkit of any economic historian working on 19th-century American business. The fact that they have not been brought to bear on this question is not primarily a failure of archival access. In 1855, John D. Rockefeller began work as a bookkeeper for 50 cents a day. By 1870, when he incorporated Standard Oil of Ohio, he controlled a refinery complex in Cleveland that was the largest in the world. By 1879, through the strategy Ida Tarbell documented and federal investigators confirmed, he had acquired or destroyed every competing refinery in Cleveland, a campaign Rockefeller himself called the scheme. The arithmetic problem remains open. A man documented to have possessed perhaps $25,000 to $40,000 in personal capital at the start of 1865 deployed $72,500 in a single transaction that same year. The philanthropic apparatus built on this foundation has not answered the question, because it has not been seriously asked to. The Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow holds the records that might answer it. If the pattern of unexplained early capital is shared by Carnegie, by Gould, by the cohort of men who became the structural architects of the Gilded Age economy, then the story we tell about how that economy was built is incomplete in a way that matters enormously. What happened between 1855 and 1865 to a 16-year-old bookkeeper who arrived in Cleveland with nothing and left the decade controlling an industrial empire in its infancy? The record shows us the beginning. The record shows us the end. What happened in the middle, where the money actually came from, who stood behind it, and what they expected in return, the record does not yet fully show. Until someone with the right access and the right institutional independence asks the question with the systematic precision it deserves, that gap will remain exactly where it has always been, hidden in plain sight, between the first ledger and the first empire,